Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Cloud Gaming Report, your weekly news source for everything going on in the world of cloud gaming. I'm your host Zach, and this week we're going to kick off by talking about the new games that have just been added to the GeForce Now platform. So this week we only have two games that have been added. We have Dead Cells and Mountain Blade Warband. So a fairly light week for GeForce Now, simply because normally they have a handful or two of games that have been added, but this week it was a light week. So moving on from there, we have an interesting article on the Nintendo Switch and how it could be getting more games in the future via the cloud. So we actually already talked about a lot of the things that the Wall Street Journal talks about in this article in a previous episode when we talked about the Resident Evil 7 on the Nintendo Switch, which is an interesting way to utilize cloud gaming. It's rather than having a full Windows desktop environment in the cloud like you do with Shadow or Liquid Sky or Paperspace, for example, you essentially just have a lightweight client for the game, and all the game itself is streamed from the cloud. So even though it might be running on a Windows server, it never is really apparent to the end user. It's more similar to what GeForce Now does, even though you kind of see the Windows environment very slightly from time to time, like when you're logging into Steam, you see the Steam client. You never actually see the full Windows environment. You don't see the Windows Start button. So it's more of an experience similar to that, but taken to the next level where you really only are launching the game, and once you start playing the game, it's all actually being streamed from the cloud. So an interesting use case of cloud gaming, and it was fairly limited though. I believe it was only available in Japan, but it was at the same time fairly cheap. It is a fairly older game, so you shouldn't expect it to be full like $60 or anything along those lines. But it was fairly cheap, even with all that taken into account. But you did only have access to the game for a set period of time. I think it was 6 months, which is more than generous to play a game like Resident Evil 7 for the most part, even if you are a casual gamer, to be able to play through the entire campaign. So definitely an interesting way to utilize the cloud for a game, and kind of taking the entire desktop experience out of the picture and providing a very simple end user experience. So today's article is kind of looking at where the future for Capcom and cloud gaming on the Nintendo Switch is. So since this article is locked behind a paywall, I do have a quote that I copied the first time I read the article, because when you navigate from Google, normally websites like the Wall Street Journal will give you access and read the full article when it's coming from Google. But then when you copy the link and paste it back into your browser, you won't be able to read it again. And I did try going back to Google and doing it, but it once again brought me to the paywall. So I did have an article that I captured the first time I read it, and I'll share that with you guys now. So begin quote: a Capcom spokeswoman said that the company would decide whether to expand its cloud offerings after assessing the performance of the Resident Evil 7 Switch version. End quote. So not a lot of details there. Not a yes, they are going to be looking at more games on the Switch via cloud gaming, and not a no at the same time. It does look like it does depend on how well Resident Evil 7 does. I hope they do take into account that it was a fairly limited launch and is more restricted based on regions, but I'm sure they're taking all that into account when they're deciding whether they want to expand this and bring their cloud gaming offerings to more regions, and also bring more games to their cloud gaming offerings. It is once again an interesting method to bring cloud gaming to the masses, and it is a very simple end user experience. So it could be a way for applications in general to really take off and start utilizing the cloud. I still prefer having the full Windows desktop, but of course I'm a super geek and like being able to tweak all the things. And I do know that from a consumer's perspective, a lot of people just want to hit the play button and start playing the game. So this could be a very interesting way for publishers to kind of cut out the middleman for cloud gaming and go directly to the consumers. So it'll be interesting to see where Capcom goes from now, but not a lot of news at this point in time now. But it definitely is becoming more mainstream in general, simply because we have the Wall Street Journal reporting on cloud gaming and Capcom in general. So the final thing I want to talk about is an article from Venturebeat. I did copy it and make it a PDF because it was a very long article. There's a lot going on, and I wanted to highlight certain things that I wanted to discuss, simply because it is such a in-depth discussion between kind of leaders of the industry. If you are interested in cloud gaming, or even the gaming industry in general, if you're a game developer or a potential game developer, an indie guy, and want to kind of see what some of the heads are kind of thinking and where their minds are on the future gaming, I would highly recommend checking out this article and reading it. When I made it into a PDF, it was like 19 pages, so it is a fair amount of reading, but there are some big pictures spread throughout there that take about half a page, so just take all that into consideration. And there is a lot of cool information here, not all of it pertaining directly to cloud gaming. For example, one of the guys in this article, one of the people that are on this talk is Doki Tops, which I might have butchered his name, of Utomic, which is a game pass like feature like Microsoft has with the Game Pass, or Origin has with Origin Access, where they offer games for a low subscription fee, and you are able to play all the games from that library for that low subscription fee. We have a lot of guys from a lot of different fields in the industry. Of Chris Early from Ubisoft. Actually, let me just go through all the names here of the main guys. So we have Jacob Navok of Genvid Technologies, Chris Early of Ubisoft, Nelson Rodriguez of Akami, and Doki Tops of Utomic. And I probably butchered some of those names, so I do apologize for that. But those were the guys from the Cloud Gaming panelist, or those were the panelists from the Cloud Gaming panel. Of course, there were other people in the audience. For example, someone from Shadow was actually quoted in this discussion. I think it was Michael Sedan, but I might have misremembered that. I do have his name highlighted further down when it does pop up. So a lot of interesting things going on here. The first thing I wanted to highlight was from Nelson. We have a interesting bit about what makes cloud gaming viable. So he essentially has 3 questions to essentially verify the viability of a cloud gaming platform. The first of which is, will the content be any good? Second, will the business model work? Is the price right for the consumers without bankrupting the publishers? And third, does the tech work? Can it get under 200 milliseconds latency? Does it feel like your controller is broken? So on the third thing, we're definitely there now. 200 milliseconds latency is a very low bar to set. I would personally set it like 100 milliseconds for a playable experience, and even 100 milliseconds isn't a great experience. But at this point in time now, the majority of our latency is actually induced due to the network, and a lot of times that's probably going to be anywhere from 30 to 50 milliseconds if you are somewhat close to the cloud gaming data center. So there's a lot going on here, but the apps themselves have got down the encoding and decoding process to be very minimal, and really only adding 1 to 5 milliseconds for the most part to that process. So like I was saying, the majority is going to be due to the network itself, and we're definitely under that 200 milliseconds unless you are very, very far from the cloud gaming data center, and then it's simply not a viable experience in my opinion. And 200 milliseconds is super high. I would set the maximum, really, like I was saying, at 100, but we definitely have hit the third as a tech work option. I think we are there for the most part. It's really going to be our network infrastructure that's holding you back. There are a lot of rural areas, even in the US, that our network infrastructure is severely lacking. I've lived places where I've only was able to get a 10 megabit per second connection, which is technically viable for cloud gaming, as long as you have good latency in conjunction with that connection, and as long as no one else on your network is using your network. So as long as someone isn't using YouTube or Netflix or anything along those lines, you can still utilize cloud gaming on a 10 megabits per second connection. You're only going to get really like a 720p stream though, so do keep all that in mind. So some very interesting questions here, and kind of leads to some interesting topics that people bring up later on too. The second part that I have highlighted here is about whether cloud gaming is the future, kind of. I'm kind of paraphrasing that, but we'll go ahead and read the full quote real quick. So, I don't think there's a question about whether customers want it or not. To me, that's different from VR. There's a question about whether the average person wants VR. For cloud gaming, there will never be a question about this. So, that was a very interesting statement. I'm also a huge proponent of VR. I think it is going to be a massive game changer in the future. But I can also see where it's not going to be super mainstream, at least not in the foreseeable future. I do think that the Oculus Go does change that drastically by not having to have a high-end smartphone, which a lot of people do have, but a lot of people don't have at the same point in time. And there are other considerations at the same point in time where you don't necessarily want to use your smartphone in the headset because it is heavily draining on your battery life, and you don't want to get to your destination with a dead phone because you're going to be using it for other things such as navigation around and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind when you're talking about playing VR off of a phone device. And I think the Oculus Go bridges a lot of the gaps between merging what the experience we have with the desktop VR and mobile VR by having a very high resolution screen and not requiring a outside device. Now with the Oculus Rift, of course, you still have 3 extra degrees of freedom, and once we bring something to like that to the Oculus Go, possibly with something with Project Santa Cruz, that's another interesting component where you don't necessarily need a desktop computer anymore. Utilize something more along the lines of the Oculus Rift. It'll be interesting to see how all that comes together in the future. But once again, I do see why it's something not everybody is going to want to game on. Whereas cloud gaming, I definitely see as going to the future is that is simply going to be the default in the future, whereas having a physical console kind of be outside the norm and kind of flipping boats in the future. Now that future might be 5-8 years away from now, but I do see in the coming years more and more people will start to utilize cloud gaming as their default option. Moving on from there, we have a little bit of a statement from Jacob Navok, and I'll go ahead and read that real quick. So furthermore, if the benefit of having a massive server farm is able to allow people to have a new experiences, why aren't you utilizing that? Why are you taking product built with the local hardware in mind and just putting that on a server? Design new forms of content that are appropriate to the cloud and monetize it with business models that are appropriate to the cloud. Why take games that are packaged and built to be put on disk and throw that same business model to the cloud? Why would you even destroy that value by throwing it away in favor of an all-you-can-eat subscription model? So some also very interesting, thoughts from Jacob there. And this is something that actually Benji and I talked about in our interview that we had on the Into the Minds between myself and Benji from Parsec, where he actually brought up a very similar idea where cloud gaming isn't just going to allow you to play your PC games in the cloud. It's also going to open up new doors for new avenues of different games and completely new experiences. Now, I don't think cloud gaming will need to strictly be brand new experiences. I do think that playing our standard PC game experiences in the cloud is a perfectly viable solution. But as with all changes, I do think that cloud gaming will open even new doors. For example, even more local games such as Crackdown 3 are utilizing cloud computing to a degree to do more complex physics actions in the game and to have a game world that is tied together between people across the world and kind of take out some of those very complex calculations and moving those to the cloud. And that's kind of a way to utilize the massive computing power that we have in these data centers to not necessarily just take our current gaming experiences and throw those in the cloud. But I think there will be a whole new level of that thinking in the coming years once we have kind of moved to the cloud as our default gaming experience and people are using that by default. I do think even more new experiences will continue to pop up where we truly utilize the massive computational power out there in all these data centers that Amazon, Microsoft, IBM are building, and to truly take our games to the next level and build brand new experiences. So a lot of talk there from Jacob, and it definitely brings up those old memories of Benji bringing up a very similar discussion point where cloud gaming will not only offer our traditional gaming in the cloud, it'll also open completely new doors for new styles of games, similar to the revolution we had when you went from like arcades to having a console in your home. It brought up completely new styles of games. And I definitely do see that cloud gaming will do that in the future, but I do think that it'll move the first experience for people will likely be playing our standard PC games in the cloud, which does still to a degree open new experiences because a lot of people don't have games that are able to fully max out the graphical fidelity. For example, playing Far Cry 5 on my local computer and then playing it on the Shadow computer, I was able to fully crank out the graphics, and that was a completely different experience because Far Cry 5 is very amazing, breathtaking with the graphics and how they like you walk between dark areas and light areas, and it has kind of the adjustment that you would with your eyes themselves, where you kind of have to adjust to the light and just the graphical fidelity in general. Being able to truly play on it with the Ultra preset was a completely different experience than I was used to on my local desktop, which isn't a chump by any stretch of the imagination. It is still decent hardware. It's an i7 from a couple years ago, and it's a couple generation old Radeon hardware GPU, but it still was very good hardware at the time. It wasn't the top of the line CPU, and it wasn't the top of the line GPU, but it was still fairly high up there on the high end of the mid-range, gaming computers at the time. And while it is now several years old, it's still decent hardware compared to kind of what the average gamer might have. And I'm still not able to fully play these games at max, settings, and being able to do that from the cloud is a different experience that's going to open more doors to people. But I definitely agree with Jacob that in the future we'll have completely new experiences, and there might be things that we can't really even dream up right now, where having massive computational power will completely change how we play games. The one thing I've always kind of imagined for many years now, as I've kind of just been aspiring to be a game developer, and it's definitely something that as an indie, it's kind of outside the reach. And I kind of see parts of it in some games that are starting to come out now, where you have a full living, breathing world where so much stuff is actually simulated in the back end, such as, for example, when I first played Minecraft many years ago, I thought it'd be awesome if like the creatures in the world, like the wolves, actually kind of bred and have populations, and if you wiped out a certain wolf area in this area, a new pack might move in, but they might have completely different, skin patterns, or pelt patterns, or stuff along those lines, and your actions in the world could drastically change how the world itself was shaped. For example, if you wiped out a predator group, you might have a sudden influx of rodents or rabbits, and they completely destroyed your crops. So having massive computational power in the back end could completely change how our games themselves act, and could have the ability to completely link worlds between different players. Even though it might not be a multiplayer experience, your actions could also influence the action or the world of other players in ways that we can't really imagine at this point now, simply because we haven't truly taken advantage of that processing power, and we're just now at this point seeing the early glimpses with games like Crackdown 3. So moving on, there it's a little while before I have another highlight. I know I talked about a lot of stuff here, and there is a ton of details here and a lot of good discussion points here. So once again, I do want to mention that I do recommend reading this. But real quick, we have the guy from Shadow. We have Michael's student from Blade Shadow, and I just wanted to highlight his name. The discussion points from him are actually further down. So Michael says that today we're going after the high-end gamer. We have to win over those influencers, those core gamers, and change the mentality. We started with a skeptical view here today. The most frequent question we have on our website is, does it work? People want to buy it. And then he moves on later on to say, right now, that price point is for the high end. Those cards are going to get old. We have excess capacity during the day. We don't necessarily have to hand you a new graphics card every time you log in, but we do today. So there's some interesting statements from there. Right now, they're going after the high-end gamer. But when he says that those cards are going to get old, what I saw interesting there is, instead of having a setup like Liquid Sky where they simply divide the hardware and subdivide it to smaller portions to provide a cheaper option. For example, you could have a situation like I have right now, where I have several generation old hardware. It still plays games, and it still plays games well. I'm just not able to fully crank out the graphics. And I think this actually would be a better setup, because with Liquid Sky, when you subdivide the system specs to a degree, you get to a point where it's simply not playable for the most part. Like, a lot of games are getting where 2 gigabytes of VRAM, which is what the gamer comes with, is not enough even if you crank down the graphics all the way. For example, we saw that with Far Cry 5. No matter how low I adjusted the settings, it didn't play on Liquid Sky very well at all. Actually, I haven't made a video on that yet, but it'll be coming out very soon. I just realized that I hadn't released that video. That'll probably be coming out next week. I have done the benchmarks. I have made the graphs. I just need to record that. So you guys haven't seen that yet, but I have seen it, and I can tell you now that the game we're playing, no matter how low I cranked the graphical settings, it didn't play well, and I think that was maybe due to the amount of RAM available, or the amount of CPU cores, or possibly even the amount of VRAM. And simply because the way that it is subdivided, you end up with modern games simply not playable. And with the way that Shadow could pull things off, and it sounds like they're kind of hinting at that here, is when the systems with the P5000s and with the new CPU upgrade, once those start to fade off, and they go to the whatever is next after the P5000, whatever card NVIDIA makes, whatever is equivalent to like the GTX 1180 or the 280, whatever NVIDIA actually ends up calling that card, whatever is equivalent to that, they could simply keep those old servers on live. Maybe they'll start to decommission some of them. Maybe they'll use some of the CPUs and combine it with a new GPU, but maybe they'll keep a portion of those online and offer a cheaper option, maybe an option that's $20 per month, and become a budget option for people, because $20 per month with unlimited hours without any restriction is a very cool option for people that are on a budget and don't want to pay $35 per month. And I can see that being a very viable option, because a P5000, which is equivalent to a GTX 1080, that'll be still playable for games, especially when you combine the fact that you have like 12 gigabytes of VRAM and 4 cores. You're going to have a computer that's going to be playable on games, for at least 3 to 4 years, unless games radically change in the next 3 to 4 years compared to what we've had in the past. So all in all, it could be a great way to still utilize some of the old hardware and provide a cheaper option for people, while still moving forward with new high-end hardware for the people that are willing to pay the $35 per month fee for having the newest and the greatest out there. So just some interesting insight from some of the people from Shadow, and I'm not sure that's exactly what he meant there. I could be taking his words and kind of thinking too much or looking too deep into them, but I could definitely see having a cheaper option being a viable solution for Shadow. Definitely, if they want to continue to capture more of the gaming market, and not a lot of people want to spend $35 per month on a gaming PC, even though they might spend that much if they were going to go with high-end hardware. Once you take into fact that a computer will only last about 3 years or so, if you always want to play on super high-end hardware, and that's even doing a GPU upgrade at some point in time, that that life cycle of your computer. If you do upgrade after 2 years, your computer might last 4 years and still are able to play the newest games. And at a certain point, you might not be able to play them on all the ultra presets, but you will be able to play on pretty high presets for the most part. I think that might be the last thing that I had highlighted here. All in all, there's a lot of good talk. Okay, here's the last point that I had highlighted. So one last thing I wanted to talk about is Jacob had another cool comment here. He says, I was at a dinner with a Chilean studio last night that's doing integrations into Twitch right now. They're starting to add these features into where the streaming service becomes interactive. And I think it was the guy's name is Dean from GamesBeat, said mix your integrations, things like that. And that's another cool aspect of where cloud gaming could be very interesting in the future, of where Twitch, Mixer, and even YouTube gaming all take advantage of aspects of cloud gaming and allow people to be interactive. So I've been thinking about ways to utilize Parsec in a similar manner, where you could have a truly interactive experience with a game that maybe you could set it up where Parsec could set it up where, for giving somebody like a $1 donation, you could have full access to their controller for 5 seconds and able to use their ulti at the most inopportune time, or something like that, to truly mess with the streamer and kind of change things up. And Mixture's kind of done some things like that if the game supports those integrations, or I don't even think the game technically has to support it, because you can simply enter key codes. For example, I was watching somebody had Overwatch set up on Mixer, and it's an interesting stream because you could pay a donation to the streamer, which benefits the streamer, to do certain things in the game. For example, I think I saw, if I remember correctly, I saw his ulti was a action that you could perform. And I might be misremembering that, but it was a very cool look into how game streaming in the terms of not cloud gaming, but just simply streaming like you do with Netflix, but with like Twitch, and what a lot of people do nowadays, instead of playing the game, they watch others play the game. And to add a little bit of interactivity to that with your bit donations and things like that will be a interesting move into the future. So it's a very interesting article and all. Like I was saying, you have a lot of different guys here and people, in fact, not just the panelists, but you have, like, for example, the employee from Shadow, Michael, who had spoke about Shadow in this. So a lot of very interesting discussion in this article. I would highly recommend reading it. There's a lot of very cool things here. I probably didn't even pick out some of the coolest things possibly. I might have missed something that you think is very interesting, but a lot of things here that shows some insight into the future of the game industry. And if you are interested in the game industry at all, or where our games might take us in the next handful of years, I would highly recommend reading this article, guys. So that's pretty much it for this week's article, guys, or episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Might have got a little long there, but that was a very interesting article. Had a lot of a very interesting discussion that was, changed into an article. There's a lot of very interesting points there, and I have said it several times now, but I would recommend reading through the whole thing. I might share the PDF that I had. I don't know if that is a good idea. Actually, I probably won't share the PDF. Just go to Venturebeat. It'll be linked in the description below, guys. I might share some of the quotes, though, about some of the things that I found particularly interesting on Twitter, just because give you some guys some, leads on where to go in the article to follow along exactly with what I was reading. But go ahead and read the whole article because there's a lot of very interesting discussion points there, guys. So all in all, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Cloud Gaming Report. The future looks very strong for cloud gaming. I do think in the next year or two, we'll start to see cloud gaming go seriously mainstream because there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. And as our network infrastructure continues to improve, and I can't wait for 5G because I think that will be a complete game changer. I hope it's half as good as it's being talked about because we're seriously looking to a massive change into how we play games in the very near future if things pan out even close to what I'm imagining. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed, or listening, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Cloud Gaming Report. Look out next week for another episode of the Cloud Gaming Report. Once again, guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, back out.